Have you ever seen a leader build something extraordinary only to be thrown out of it in front of the entire world? What would you do if the very people who praised your success suddenly decided you didn't fit the culture? And more importantly, what happens when someone refuses to walk away quietly? This is the story of Eleanor Matthews, the first Black woman to lead Wall Street Trust in New York City. In just 18 months, she boosted profits, expanded opportunities, and won national recognition. Yet one Friday afternoon, she was humiliated, boxed up like an afterthought, and told to leave her own bank. But Eleanor wasn't walking out in silence. He's a problem. Hidden in her briefcase was a plan that would flip the script, not just for her, but for an entire industry. Let's uncover how it all unfolded. Right now, Eleanor Matthews had spent her entire career proving that she belonged in places where for far too long people who looked like her were not expected to stand. She was the first Black woman to lead Wall Street Trust, a bank headquartered in New York City that had been around for more than a century. For 18 months, she carried the weight of that history. And in those months, the numbers told a story no one could ignore. Profits climbed 22%. Customer retention improved. The bank finally began to connect with neighborhoods it had neglected for decades. If success was measured by results, Eleanor had exceeded every benchmark. Yet on one Friday afternoon in a conference room lined with mahogany and glass, the people who held power decided that none of it mattered. The humiliation was orchestrated. Charles Whitaker, the chairman of the board, was a man born into money, his grandfather's name carved into the marble lobby of the bank. He did not hand Eleanor a polite letter of termination. Instead, in front of a dozen board members and assistants, he slammed down a cardboard box so hard that the table rattled. Coffee spilled across the polished surface, and a silence fell over the room that carried the weight of centuries. Inside that box, placed there by someone who had gone through her office in advance, were her framed photographs, her award from the American Bankers Association, and even her Harvard diploma. Its corner bent as if to say that her education, her excellence, her hard-earned credibility were disposable. The message was not subtle. You are not one of us. You were never meant to last. Moments like these are not confined to the world of fiction. In 2013, for example, Ursula Burns, the first Black woman to lead a Fortune 500 company, spoke candidly about the subtle but constant reminders that she did not belong in the boardroom she entered. She endured them with grace, but she acknowledged that the system was not built for people like her. Eleanor's experience echoed that truth on a stage that was both intimate and public. The board intended the act as a private dismissal. But in a world of smartphones and live streams, nothing stays hidden. Several employees had dialed in via Zoom to observe the meeting, expecting a quarterly update. One of them, Rachel Flores, a young Latina analyst, realized immediately what was happening and began recording her screen. Within hours, clips of the confrontation would circle Twitter and TikTok, sparking a storm no one on that board anticipated. For Eleanor, those first minutes were a test of composure. The instinct to defend herself, to raise her voice, to plead for fairness, pressed hard against the dignity she had cultivated throughout her career. Instead, she sat still, her hands resting lightly on her leather briefcase. That briefcase contained what no one in the room could see. 3 months of meticulous preparation emails, preserved conversations documented, and a plan forged with a team of attorneys who understood that discrimination was not an anecdote, but a case. As Whitaker sneered about her leadership style, not fitting the culture, she thought of the tellers in Harlem, whose job she had fought to save, of a single mother in Queens, whose small business loan she had personally approved, and of the janitor whose son she had mentored into an internship. These people knew her worth, even if the board chose to erase it. For the board, it was business as usual. They cloaked their actions in the language of cultural alignment and traditional expectations, phrases that in corporate America often mask biases no one wishes to name aloud. Studies have shown that Black executives are often judged not by performance, but by perceptions of fit. A 2019 Harvard Business Review article documented how many leaders of color were sidelined despite stellar results because they did not embody the image boards we're comfortable with. Eleanor's removal was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern that those who watch closely have seen unfold too many times. The board assumed that, like others before her, she would pack her belongings, walk away quietly, and accept the narrative they had already written. But quiet was never her intention. The lesson here is subtle but vital. In moments of humiliation, when dignity is stripped away in public, the power to respond lies not in matching the cruelty, but in preparing for the long game. Eleanor's calm that afternoon was not weakness. It was strategy. Many of us may never sit at the head of a corporate bank, but we know the feeling of being underestimated, of being told that we don't belong in rooms we've worked hard to enter. The small lesson her story offers is this: preparation transforms humiliation into opportunity. Whether in the workplace, in community life, or even within our own families, documentation and foresight are shields. They turn what could be a fleeting injustice into evidence that demands accountability. As the meeting dragged on, Eleanor's silence unsettled the room. Board member Lydia Grant, who had long disagreed with Whitaker but rarely spoke up, shifted uncomfortably. She knew the optics were terrible, knew that if the footage ever leaked, the bank's reputation could crumble. Harold King, the IT director, noticed the spike in network traffic as employees messaged each other about what they were seeing. And Marcus Lee, head of security, hesitated when Whitaker barked that Eleanor should be escorted from a building. Marcus remembered the day Eleanor had fought to fund scholarships for the children of custodial staff, including his own son. Loyalty once tested does not vanish easily. These witnesses would matter later, but in the moment they represented the quiet cracks forming in the facade of power. Outside the building, life in New York went on as usual. Tourists took photos in Times Square. Traders hurried across Wall Street. But inside that boardroom, history was tilting. Eleanor looked around at the faces of those who thought they had ended her career and recognized something they could not yet see: the beginning of their unraveling. What the board dismissed as a routine termination would become a catalyst. The live stream Rachel had started reached her college network by nightfall. By morning, hashtags would trend, and within days, the name Eleanor Matthews would not just belong to a dismissed CEO, but to a movement that questioned who gets to hold power in America's banks. The fall of Eleanor Matthews was designed to be a quiet eraser, but instead it became a spark. Like many turning points in history, it began not with triumph, but with humiliation, not with applause, but with silence heavy enough to hear a heart beating. It is in these silences that resilience is born. And as Eleanor walked out of that conference room with her briefcase still in hand, the story had only just begun. Because when the powerful miscalculate, when they underestimate the resolve of those they seek to diminish, the stage is set for allies to rise, for truth to surface, and for justice to find its way. That is where we go next. The unexpected voices who refuse to let her fall alone. In every great turning point, the spotlight often falls on a central figure. But history is rarely changed by one person alone. For Eleanor Matthews, the day she was humiliated in the boardroom of Wall Street Trust might have ended in silence, if not for the ordinary employees who refused to let her fall quietly. They were not executives with polished resumes or shareholders with millions at stake. They were security chiefs, junior analysts, and mid-level managers. People whose names rarely make headlines. Yet in that moment, they became allies whose courage shifted the balance of power. Marcus Lee had worked at Wall Street Trust for over 15 years. As head of security, he was the kind of man most people barely noticed stationed near entrances, making sure the building was safe, ensuring that clients felt secure. He had seen dozens of executives come and go. But Eleanor was different. When she first became CEO, she had stopped to learn his name. And a week later, she asked about his son. That son, a bright but quiet teenager, wanted to study engineering, but didn't think college was possible. Eleanor didn't just nod politely. She introduced Marcus to a scholarship program at Columbia University. Within months, his son was enrolled with funding. That kind of gesture, small to an executive, but life-changing to a family, is never forgotten. So, when Charles Whitaker ordered Marcus to escort Eleanor out of the building, Marcus hesitated. He remembered the woman who treated him like more than a uniform. He remembered the way she saw his son's potential. And in that hesitation, a quiet form of defiance was born. Not far away, another ally was making a choice. Rachel Flores, a 25-year-old analyst, was sitting at her desk on the 12th floor when she realized the Zoom call she had joined was not just another quarterly review. She watched Eleanor being boxed out of her career in real time. Rachel thought of her mother, who worked 2 jobs as a waitress to send her to college. She thought of her abuela, who came from Puerto Rico with nothing but a belief that her granddaughter would one day make it. The board's words, "not the right cultural fit," rang in her ears, as something her own family had heard in different forms for decades. Rachel pressed record. Her hands shook as she decided to share the footage with a small circle of friends. She did not know it would spread across Twitter by nightfall, nor did she anticipate that hashtags would trend the next morning. She only knew she could not watch injustice unfold and remain silent. Her instinct to bear witness became a spark. Then there was Lydia Grant, a mid-level credit manager in her 50s. She was white middle class, the kind of person the board imagined as safe. Yet Lydia had spent years quietly pushing back against lending practices she believed were unfair. She had seen applications from Black and Latino families denied for flimsy reasons, while others with nearly identical profiles were approved. When Eleanor arrived as CEO, Lydia finally felt seen. Eleanor gave her the support to adjust policies, and for the first time in her career, Lydia felt she was part of something more than transactions. Watching the board dismantle Eleanor's career felt like a personal betrayal. In the weeks that followed, Lydia would become one of the first to provide testimony to Eleanor's legal team, confirming a pattern of discrimination in lending. At the time of the boardroom drama, though, she simply sat in stunned silence, already imagining how she would respond. She knew the truth. She knew the truth. When people at the top abuse their power, it is often the ordinary ones who must decide whether to look away or to speak. If you look across history, you find that movements are rarely fueled only by leaders. During the civil rights era, Dr. King gave the speeches, but it was the countless nameless marchers, mothers, and college students who filled the streets that made the dream visible. In the corporate world, whistleblowers like Sharon Watkins at Enron or Frances Hogan at Facebook were not CEOs. Yet, their decision to tell the truth altered entire industries. Eleanor's allies fit this same pattern. They were not positioned to command authority, but they chose honesty when silence would have been safer. It's important to recognize how risky those choices were. For Rachel, recording the live stream could have meant losing her job before her career even began. For Marcus, refusing to immediately follow Whitaker's order could have been seen as insubordination. For Lydia, siding with Eleanor meant alienating herself from peers who prefer to protect their own positions. Yet each of them calculated in that moment that integrity mattered more than comfort. The lesson here is both simple and profound. Change often begins with ordinary people deciding that silence costs too much. You may never sit in a boardroom, but in your workplace, in your neighborhood, in your family, there will be moments when you must decide whether to look away or to stand beside someone who is being pushed out unfairly. Courage in those small choices adds up to transformation. The social media age added another layer. Rachel's live stream reached thousands within hours. A friend of hers at Howard University shared it to a student network. Soon, young people from historically Black colleges were commenting, organizing, and pushing the story into national attention. It is one thing for an injustice to occur behind closed doors. It is another when it unfolds in real time on millions of screens. The board underestimated how quickly digital solidarity can build. By morning, hashtags like Justice for Eleanor and Banking While Black were circulating across platforms. It was not only students who cared. Middle-aged, churchgoers, retired teachers, small business owners, people who might otherwise have glanced past corporate news saw in Eleanor's humiliation a mirror of stories they knew from their own lives. The community outside the bank became an unexpected ally, amplifying the voices of those inside who had chosen to resist. Examples of this phenomenon abound. In 2018, when Starbucks employees in Philadelphia called the police on two black men who were simply waiting for a business meeting, it was a bystander video that ignited national outrage. The company was forced to close thousands of stores for racial bias training. The people who filmed, shared, and refused to normalize what they saw made the difference. Eleanor's story is not separate from that lineage. It is another reminder that accountability thrives in the light. As the hours passed after Eleanor's dismissal, Marcus checked on her quietly, assuring her that not everyone in the building stood against her. Rachel watched her video climb into tens of thousands of views, feeling both terrified and proud. Lydia drafted an email she would later send to the legal team, laying out her concerns with the bank's lending practices. These were small acts, but together they formed the beginnings of a shield around Eleanor. She was no longer standing alone. By Monday, when reporters began to call the bank, the board realized their narrative had slipped from their hands. They had hoped to describe Eleanor's exit as a mutual departure. Instead, they were facing headlines about racial discrimination and corporate arrogance. That shift in narrative would not have been possible without the allies who had chosen to act. For Eleanor, their support was more than strategic. It was personal. It reminded her that the community she had quietly built within the bank, from the security team to the credit managers, saw her worth beyond numbers on a balance sheet. And so, a small but powerful truth emerges. Revolutions, whether in politics or in corporations, begin when ordinary people refuse to be complicit. Each ally of Eleanor's represents someone we might know in our own lives. The coworker who risks speaking up. The friend who records what others try to hide. The manager who quietly collects evidence of wrongdoing. They show us that while leaders may fall alone, they rise again through the hands of those who stand beside them. As the story of Eleanor Matthews continued, the presence of these allies set the stage for what would come next. Because allies could only carry the truth so far. To turn it into change required strategy, law, and an army prepared to challenge centuries of bias in the financial world. And that was exactly what walked through the doors of Wall Street Trust in the days that followed Eleanor's legal team. Armed not only with evidence, but with the determination to flip the script entirely. The Monday after Eleanor Matthews was forced out of Wall Street Trust, the atmosphere in the bank's headquarters was tense. Employees whispered in hallways. Reporters camped outside the marble lobby, and the board tried desperately to contain a story that had already spiraled beyond their control. What they didn't realize was that Eleanor had been preparing for this moment far longer than they had been plotting her removal. Her counterattack had been months in the making, and when it arrived, it came not in the form of angry speeches, but in the quiet, disciplined march of lawyers, carrying briefcases heavier than any insult the board could deliver. The first to step into the boardroom was attorney Jasmine Carter, a tall woman in her 40s with a reputation forged in the courtrooms of Chicago. She had built her career on representing employees in discrimination suits against Fortune 500 companies and had never lost a major case. Her presence alone shifted the energy. Behind her came David Chun, a former Securities and Exchange Commission investigator, meticulous in his knowledge of banking regulations. Beside him walked Angela Robinson, a young black attorney whose own application to Wall Street Trust had once been dismissed for reasons never explained. She smiled faintly as she entered, knowing she was about to hold accountable the very people who once overlooked her. The three of them, along with two paralegals carrying boxes of documents, looked less like guests and more like a legal strike team. Eleanor had reached out to them months earlier after the first time she heard the board whisper about cultural fit. She knew those words were not about her leadership style. They were about her identity. Instead of reacting immediately, she began documenting everything. Every coded comment, every questionable denial of a loan to minority applicants, every meeting where her suggestions were brushed aside. With Jasmine's guidance, she built a case so solid that it could withstand the scrutiny of federal courts. What the board thought was a simple dismissal was in fact the final act of a trap they had walked into. As Jasmine began to speak, she did not raise her voice. She calmly laid out the evidence email chains where Whitaker's suggested clients preferred a more traditional facile approval data, showing black applicants rejected at twice the rate of white applicants with similar credit scores, and recordings of board discussions that revealed a pattern of exclusion. David Chun distributed binders to each board member filled with charts, transcripts, and legal citations. "What you're holding, Jasmine," said evenly, "is evidence of systemic discrimination in violation of federal law. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and whistleblower protection statutes are all in play here. This is no longer a personnel matter. This is a federal matter." The boardroom fell silent. Charles Whitaker, who had been so forceful only days earlier, now looked pale. He muttered something about entrapment, but Angela Robinson quickly responded, "Georgia is a one-party consent state. Every recording Dr. Matthews made is fully admissible. You cannot wish away the truth." She flipped open a folder and read aloud a direct quote from a January meeting. "Our clients expect someone who looks like them." The timestamp was clear. The speaker identified as Whitaker himself. There was no denying it. For employees who had gathered outside the boardroom doors, the sight of this legal team was a revelation. They realized Eleanor had not been defeated. She had been patient. It was a reminder that true strength often hides in preparation. In corporate America, too many cases of discrimination are dismissed as hearsay or emotion. Eleanor had transformed her lived experience into evidence that spoke the language of power law data and precedent. The lesson here extends beyond banking. In any field, whether you're a teacher facing unfair evaluations or a nurse witnessing bias in promotions, documentation is the most powerful ally you can have. Feelings are dismissed. Facts demand response. Eleanor's story shows that the path from victimhood to vindication is paved with preparation. She did not wait for justice to stumble upon her. She built a case so strong that justice had no choice but to follow. Real-world examples echo this. When Wells Fargo was fined for discriminatory lending practices in 2012, it was not because executives suddenly confessed. It was because whistleblowers and investigators compiled hard data proving the pattern. Similarly, when Uber faced lawsuits over workplace discrimination, it was employees documenting emails, HR reports, and personal testimonies that forced the company to reckon with its culture. Eleanor's approach fits squarely within this lineage, the careful conversion of injustice into irrefutable evidence. As the lawyers finished their presentation, Jasmine delivered the ultimatum. The bank had two options: reinstate Eleanor with expanded authority and commit to sweeping reforms, or face federal trial with full discovery subpoenas and the risk of losing its charter. It was not a threat. It was the legal reality. The board members shifted uneasily, their authority dissolving as quickly as the press releases they had once controlled. Outside phones buzzed with updates from reporters already catching wind of the legal action. The world was watching. Eleanor said little during the proceedings. She sat with quiet dignity, letting the evidence speak for itself. But when Whitaker tried one last time to accuse her of orchestrating a circus, she finally met his eyes. "I did not create this," she said softly. "You did. I only brought the receipts." The phrase rippled through the room, repeated later in news headlines, becoming a rallying cry for those who had faced similar dismissals. By the time the legal team left, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The board, once confident in its ability to erase Eleanor, now faced the possibility of erasing itself. The employees who had stood by silently began to murmur with hope. And Eleanor, walking out of the room with her allies, knew that the counterattack had only begun. The legal front was established, but the true test was still ahead. Because exposing wrongdoing is one thing. Forcing change upon an unwilling institution is another. The next chapter would not just be about justice in a boardroom. It would be about federal oversight, public scrutiny, and the transformation of an entire industry. And that is where the story turns next. The moment humiliation gave way to federal justice. The boardroom that had once been a stage for Eleanor Matthews' humiliation was now transformed into something else entirely. What began as a dismissal designed to erase her career had grown into a standoff with consequences far beyond Wall Street trust. The presence of Jasmine Carter and her team of attorneys shifted the atmosphere from smug certainty to palpable fear. By now, the board understood this was not going to fade quietly into the background. The ultimatum was clear. Either reinstate Eleanor and reform the bank or face federal trial with the very real possibility of losing everything. The moment marked a turning point not only for Eleanor, but for an institution that represented the old guard of American finance. News of the confrontation could not be contained. Rachel Flores's recording shared across social media had already attracted tens of thousands of views by the time Jasmine presented the legal documents. Within hours, major outlets picked up the story. The New York Times ran a headline, "Wall Trust Faces Allegations of Racial Bias" at the top. By the following morning, CNN and Bloomberg were analyzing the potential fallout for the bank and its parent holding company. Reporters gathered outside the building, their cameras trained on the glass doors through which board members now had to walk. No longer anonymous figures, but symbols of a crumbling system. Employees who once carried themselves with corporate detachment now whispered in elevators and hallways about the shame their institution had brought upon itself. The board had underestimated one critical factor: reputation. In the modern world, especially in finance, trust is currency. When trust collapses, no balance sheet can save you. Federal scrutiny quickly followed. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency announced an emergency review of Wall Street Trust's lending practices. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York scheduled an audit. The Department of Justice signaled interest in pursuing a civil rights investigation. To those outside the banking world, these names may sound like bureaucracies, but to insiders, they're storm clouds that can topple entire empires. Suddenly, the humiliation meant for Eleanor was instead pressing down on the men and women who had tried to erase her. The lesson here is simple, yet profound: institutions built on arrogance are far more fragile than they appear. When you assume power shields you from accountability, you overlook the truth that power without trust collapses under its own weight. Eleanor's story illustrates how quickly the balance can shift. On Friday, she was handed a cardboard box as though her career could be packed away. By Monday, it was the board scrambling their authority, leaking away with every news notification. History is full of such reversals. In 2008, some of the largest financial firms in the world, institutions that had stood for a century, collapsed within weeks when confidence evaporated. Reputation and trust are not abstract values. They're the foundation on which entire industries rest. Examples from outside finance reinforce the same truth. When United Airlines forcibly removed a passenger in 2017, it was not just a single incident of poor judgment. It was the viral video that cost the company hundreds of millions in value and forced apologies from the highest levels. In each case, the tipping point came when ordinary people witnessed injustice and refused to let it pass. Eleanor's allies, from Rachel with her recording to Marcus with his hesitation to follow orders, helped turn an act of humiliation into evidence of systemic wrongdoing. Social media amplified it, and suddenly what was supposed to be a quiet Friday meeting became a national conversation about discrimination in corporate America. Inside the bank, cracks widened. Customers began calling to close accounts. One longtime commercial client, Thomas Reed, whose construction company held millions in deposits, phoned Charles Whitaker directly to say that his firm could not be associated with a bank under federal investigation. "This isn't just business," Reed said. "This is about values." His departure sent a signal to others, and by the end of the week, more than $20 million in deposits had been scheduled for withdrawal. For banks, which rely on customer confidence to function daily, this was nothing short of catastrophic. Employees began to realize their jobs, their pensions, their very futures were tied to a decision made by a handful of board members who had chosen arrogance over fairness. For Eleanor, the turning point was not only external, it was deeply personal. She had been shamed in front of her peers, But now she watched as the same board who mocked her steadiness squirmed under the weight of federal oversight. She did not gloat. Her character would not allow it. But she understood something powerful. Patience had delivered her vindication. The dignity she displayed in silence had become her strength. That is another lesson worth holding on to. In moments of injustice, the urge to respond immediately with anger is strong. Yet sometimes true power lies in restraint, in building a foundation so solid that when the moment arrives, truth speaks louder than rage ever could. The board attempted one last maneuver. They floated the idea of negotiating Eleanor's departure with a generous severance package. Jasmine Carter shut it down with a single sentence. "This isn't about money. It's about justice." Those words resonated beyond the walls of the bank. Reporters repeated them. Community leaders echoed them. And employees took them to heart. For too long, discrimination cases have been quietly settled with payouts that protected reputations but never forced change. Eleanor's case was different. It demanded transformation, not hush money. The symbolism of federal involvement mattered greatly. For communities who had long felt ignored by financial institutions, this was proof that their voices could reach the highest levels of government. Community leaders from Harlem to Detroit organized small rallies holding signs that read, "Banking while black should not be a crime." It was not just Eleanor's fight anymore. It had become a collective demand for accountability. This is how turning points work. They start with one person's pain and expand until they reveal a truth shared by many. Employees inside the bank also felt the shift. Lydia Grant, the credit manager who had witnessed years of discriminatory lending, finally felt empowered to provide a sworn statement. Marcus Lee confided to a colleague that he had no regrets about hesitating to remove Eleanor. Rachel Flores, who once feared losing her job, was now invited to speak to journalists about what she had seen. Their courage multiplied in the light of public scrutiny. That is another lesson for us. Courage is contagious. One person's decision to stand often gives others permission to do the same. By the end of the second week, it was no longer a question of whether the board would back down, but how much of the institution would survive. The humiliation designed for Eleanor had become humiliation for the board itself. And more importantly, it had sparked a national conversation about who gets to lead and why identity should never disqualify competence. Eleanor, once isolated in her struggle, now found herself carried by a wave of support that stretched from community organizations to federal agencies. As she walked past reporters one evening, Eleanor paused to speak briefly. Her words were simple but memorable. "This was never about me. It's about fairness, about who we are willing to trust with power. If this moment leads to change, then the humiliation I faced was worth it." Those words broadcast on national television reframed the entire saga. It was no longer just a story of one woman against a board. It was a story about America grappling with the biases still embedded in its institutions. The turning point then was not a single dramatic event, but a series of ripples that built into a wave. The legal team's arrival, the federal scrutiny, the loss of clients, the courage of employees, and the amplification of community voices. Together, they shifted the narrative from personal defeat to systemic accountability. And as the pressure mounted, everyone knew that the board could no longer pretend this was business as usual. Something much larger was underway. The story now moves into its final chapter, not simply about survival or reinstatement, but about transformation. What began as an attempt to erase Eleanor Matthews had become an opportunity to remake Wall Street trust itself. The question was no longer whether she would return, but how the institution would be rebuilt in the wake of federal justice. And that is where we turn next. The transformation of a bank and the birth of a new model for equity and finance. When Eleanor Matthews walked back through the doors of Wall Street Trust on the Monday of her reinstatement, the building felt transformed. The same lobby where security had once prepared to escort her out now echoed with quiet applause from employees who had witnessed her dignity under fire. This time, Eleanor's authority came not only from her title, but from federal oversight and a wave of public trust. Under the settlement terms, the bank agreed to sweeping reforms, a restructured board with 40% minority representation, mandatory training on bias, and a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to small business loans in underserved communities. What was meant to end one woman's career became the beginning of an institutional rebirth. The results were visible within months. Families in Harlem and the Bronx secured home loans they had been denied for years. A restaurant in Detroit owned by Maria Rodriguez received financing that allowed her to hire 12 employees and mentor other minority business owners. For the first time in its long history, Wall Street Trust was recognized by the Federal Reserve as a model of equitable lending. Employees who had once felt invisible now found their voices valued in decision-making. Customers who had closed accounts returned, bringing new ones with them. Trust once shattered was rebuilt through accountability. The lesson is clear. When injustice is confronted directly, transformation is possible not only for individuals, but for entire systems. Eleanor's story reminds us that one act of courage backed by preparation and supported by allies can ripple outward to touch thousands of lives. What began as humiliation ended as a blueprint for fairness in banking, proving that institutions can change when people refuse to accept silence. This chapter closes not on defeat, but on possibility. Eleanor Matthews did not simply reclaim her position. She redefined what leadership looks like in American finance. And her story leaves us with a challenge. If one case could change an entire bank, what could happen if more of us chose to stand a document and to fight back when injustice appears? Share this story. Add your voice in the comments. And subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and transformation, because change begins when stories like Eleanor's are old.